If you want to do screen sharing, I think you click the video thing up there and then just stop.
Say that again, Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very meta. Very, very meta. Where are So are you logged into that Hangout? What do you see?
I got an info, so I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, she is.
So, all right, awesome. Thanks. All right, so get us kicked off here. I had some notes, but I don't have them up. So thanks everybody for coming out to the dev group. So in the announcement and also in the Slack channel, I try to ask people to RSVP so we don't end up with, I think last time we had 42 and this room holds 30 something. So we had a lot of extra chairs and people standing around. This time around, we look like we're a little bit less and we have a bunch of pizza because we weren't sure how many people were coming. So if you get a chance, please either RSVP through email or on the Slack channel when I post the little poll, so I can know exactly how much we need for each meeting. So some of them I think are going to be larger than others, and if possible, if we get that notice ahead of time, we can get the building 3 auditorium, so we'll be a lot more comfortable. Other times when it's about this size or less than I think 36 is what this holds, then it's probably good to have it in here, so everyone's kind of close. I won't go into the redneck story because everyone's here probably tired of hearing it. I would just say that the more help we get, the better. So there is this channel that we use to post the issues, or not issues, suggestions, and we vote them up and down. This one was highly voted on, but it was actually a combination of Angular 1.x and 2.0. The guy that's going to do the 2.0 part, he had another conflicting meeting. So we're just going to do 1.x this time, and then we'll have the 2.0 scheduled, I think, about 4 weeks from now. I'm not sure what the next topic is. Remember what the next topic is? It's Git. Yeah, so there's going to be another day of Git next week. The next meeting was 2 weeks from now. More likely in the same location. Okay? So today we're going to be talking just about Angular 1.x. So how many people are actually using Angular at this moment? That's one. I know Joseph. I know Angus. All right. So we're gonna do like a. This talk was initially going to be like 15, 20 minutes. Now we're going to expand it out to be the whole time. Right. Yeah, exactly. So there's actually that's what they call it. When you Google it, they'll say all their releases are actually named by here. Oh my! Yeah. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So we'll jump into it. There's a lot of cover. There's no way to cover all of Angular 1.x in 1 hour. So we'll kind of gloss over some things. If you have a question, stop me, and we'll dive into that. Okay. All right. So what is Angular 1.x? There's the website there. There's 2 websites because there's a 1.x branch and a 2.0 branch. They are the same name, but they are framework. Right? They have concepts that are similar, right? But they are it's a rewrite from the ground up. Bunch of different concepts existing ones. Right? So the one, if you're looking for 1.x, which is in production ready, right now the current is 1.5.8. And our Angular 2 is in, I think, RC, release candidate 2 right now. So it should be coming out as just soon, but it's not there yet. So Angular 1.x is an MB star JavaScript framework. Right, so MB is model view, and then the star stands for controller, presenter, or model. Basically anything that you want to put else in there, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. So the model is your data or your core business logic, right? Your view is just your HTML. Well, that's right, your HTML, right? And then the other star part is the glue, right? The thing that sits between your view and your model, right? So what you call that depends on your style, right? Some people say it's a controller. Actually, terminology here is controller. But without the controller, there's a thing called scope, which is kind of represents the view model, right? So depending on what your background is, you may look at that star part a little bit differently. They all work the same, more or less. So before I said this is a superhero framework, right? So what's the difference between a framework and a library, right? So there's a bunch of, well, how many people are actually on JavaScript? All right. So you guys know there's a new framework library every other second. One of the good things to know is which ones are libraries and which ones are frameworks, because those will behave slightly differently, right? So libraries include like jQuery. jQuery is a library, right? It's a very, very big library, but it's a library. It has a lot of plugins and stuff onto it. Knockout, which is one of the first in this series of data binding and kind of modern JavaScript landscape. That one's also a library, I believe. Kind of like in teeter-totters between the two, that one and Backbone, which I don't have listed here. React is all the hotness now, like that's what all the cool kids are doing. That one is a library. People mistake it as a framework, but it is a library. It only handles the view portion of your NV star thing, but it is very popular for a lot of reasons. A lot of the way Angular 2 is modeled after some of the learnings from React, right? So Vue is another one. It's also very similar to React, but it has a Angular style binding syntax to it. But again, a library. It handles the view part of your NV star framework. Right? So what's the difference? So Angular is a framework, Aurelia is a framework, Ember is a framework, and there's others. Right? But these are kind of the big ones, right? The more popular ones, I should say. So Angular will give you more things out of the box. It gives you data binding. It'll give you routing, which you don't get in those other libraries, right? It'll give you a way of getting your data, like an HTTP client, right? And a number of other things that we'll touch on. Actually, I guess we'll go there right now for a second. Just to kind of show you some of this is the website here. And if you want to get the latest version, actually, I thought I said 1.5.8. It's actually 1.5.7. That's the current version. If you actually stay here for a second, if you want to download it, you can just click here and download it. There's also CDNs for it. If you're doing it locally here, I would recommend just downloading your own copies versus using a CDN, because the CDN is never going to be closer than your server's local, right? So I would just recommend doing that. There's a 1.x branch and then there's a 1.5 branch. But if you don't have any other dependencies, I would just go with the latest version. So you can get it minified, gzip, all that stuff, right? And if you have npm or you're doing Bower, it's also available there as well. Just to kind of show you some of the API surface, why I say we're not going to be able to cover all of this. I know this is probably pretty small. Right? So all of this is the API for Angular 1.x. One of the reasons for Angular 2.0 is because the API for Angular 2.0 is much smaller, right? Because you don't have to have a bunch of built-in directives like the Angular 1.x one. And I'll talk about why that is too as well. All right, cool. So Angular 1.x is a relatively old framework in terms of JavaScript time, right? Remember I said there's been 12 different frameworks since I started talking that have been released, right? Angular 1.0 started about 6+ years ago, right? And that's important to note because some of the way that things are done in that framework are reflected from that history of where it came from, right? So for example, there was really no module system when Angular first started. So that's why you'll have the Angular.module syntax in there built into the framework so they can get ways of namespacing your code down to a certain area. Right? So, and then I mentioned Angular 2.0 is in RC. The RC may be misleading because they've been working on Angular 2.0 for about 2.5 years. Right? It still hasn't been released yet, but it's getting close. But close is relative. All right, so some of the Angular 1.x concepts, we won't cover all of them today, but we'll kind of try to touch on most of them. Data binding, two-way data binding, which at first you look at it like, this is awesome. And then later on you get a really big act like, this sucks. But it can be your friend if you use it in the right way. Right? The module system, like I just mentioned, that is really good for JavaScript. I'm not sure if you've been doing JavaScript for a little while, you realize that you can have variable collisions, right? If you're not scoping your variables properly. There is no block scoping in JavaScript, right? There's only function scoping. So what that means is that if you say var I in a loop, right, that I is visible to the entire scope, right? Even though you've declared it inside of the loop, it gets hoisted to the top and basically gets set as undefined until the point where your loop starts. But if you have two loops that say var I, right, then you're gonna get weird bugs, right? So just remember that function scoping, block scoping, one of the reasons for the module system. So in the announcement that went out, we talked about directives. I don't think anyone can see that because they're
Someone's on.
yeah. So the directives are what you use to actually. Directives are the part of Angular that's really cool, right? So that's the stuff that you see where I have a section of code and UI that I want to repeat over and over, right? So I can make that into a directive, and basically I can make a brand new HTML tag that the browser now understands because of Angular, right? So let's say, for example, you had a tag, a grid. Yeah, I say grid. Grids are really, really hard, so I wouldn't start there. But let's say you had a grid, right? And your grid was named some type of data. I think in Layton's app, it's a container. What is it called, Layton?
You could just use the actual grid.
Yeah, so there's an actual grid. So they're dealing with money, and the actuals that come in from transactions, they put them into a grid, and they call it the actuals grid. Instead of having that very complex structure of HTML and all that stuff that goes along with it, everywhere that grid needs to be, you can create a brand new tag and say, this thing is the actuals grid. So when you're looking at your HTML, it just says actuals grid and have the variables in it. And I'll show you an example of that later on. One of the other things that's cool is that Angular itself is built on the same directive system that you can actually employ. Right? So there's some built-in directives. The list that we went through, a lot of them are built-in directives that use the same mechanism, but they're built in out of the box because a lot of people need them. There's other topics in there like transclusion. If you Google for a little while, you'll see transclusion. Like it is a real word, right? and it actually is a computer science term from back in the day, right? Basically, in short, it means like if I have let's say I have a directive that represents a WYSIWYG editor, right? So you have the part at the top with your like bold and italics and all that stuff, right? But then inside of that, you want someone to be able to type in there, right? So what that allows you to do is to say I have a frame and I'm gonna give this spot in the middle for whatever you want to put in there, right? So you can put your own tags in there or whatever the case may be, and it'll wrap it around there. So that's in short transclusion, right? Filters are another one as well. This is actually an interesting one. If you get a chance, I'll put in the notes. There's a guy, his name's Shai Resnick. He's done 2 talks at the last 2 big Angular conferences. He makes fun of the Angular team in Angular, and it's hilarious. Even if you don't know Angular, it's still funny. One of the things that he brags on is the filter, because there's multiple filters in Angular. One of them is called the filter. He definitely makes a lot of fun of that one, right? So we'll actually see the filter in one of the demos that we have later. We have controllers as well. So remember I said there was MB star, and that star in here is more or less the controller. They call it a controller, but it works slightly different from a regular controller. $scope is like the view model of that controller. Factories, services, values, and providers. lots of different names for the same thing. Right? If you're starting off now, I would start with either the factory or the service. The factory is easier. The service more models what Angular 2 does. Right? But for this example, I don't think I even have any in the code. I didn't get around to write them, but I'll show you examples of factories in the code base and another code base. Dependency injection. How many people are familiar with dependency injection? Cool. All right, so Angular uses dependency injection very, very heavily. Right? So everywhere that you need something, you need to inject it in. And it makes your life a little bit easier, but it also made the way they did it in Angular 1. If you work with it for long enough, you can run into some edge cases. So one of the edge cases in particular is because the way it does injection, it uses a string or token, right? That works perfectly fine until you minify your code, right? When you go to production, you minify it, and it basically takes your nice, beautiful, readable variable name and takes it out and puts an A in there, right? It knows what it means, right? But now the injector can't find A because A does not exist, right? So there's ways around that though. One of the other things I mentioned too is routing. Oh, not routing. The difference between frameworks and libraries, right? So in a library, you won't necessarily get routing, right? In a framework, you will. So there's two main routers for Angular. There's the NG route. That's the one that's quote unquote built in, but no one uses it, right? Even the Angular team does not recommend it. So the other one that's more popular is a community run router, and that's the UI router. And we'll see an example of the UI router in the code base later. There's also built-in Angular functions like is defined, is undefined, some nice to have type things as you're working through your code. Animation is built in. So you can get the nice cool effects from one screen transitioning to another. You can have it fade in or move this, move that. I don't tend to do it that much, but I hear the cool kids like it. So dollar inject is what we talked about before. The injector, it helps with the injecting. So if you're minifying your code, this will protect you when you do that. Bootstrap is not the actual like CSS bootstrap, but there's different ways of bootstrapping your app, like starting your app up. Right? The digest cycle is an interesting thing. So we'll talk digest cycle and watchers together. So there's some magic that happens, but it's not really magic once you dig into it, right? It's just code that maybe a person don't understand. It's great to have the magic at first, but when you get to certain scales, not understanding what's happening behind the scenes can come back to bite you as far as performance goes, right? So the digest cycle is, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and watchers, and then 1.5 plus introduced components. Everything in Angular 2, everything in Angular 2 is based on components, right? So right now, what they're trying to give us is a nice path from the 1.x to 2.0, right? So if you're starting things now, components basically replace directives, all of them, controllers, and a couple other concepts, right? So all those concepts got wrapped into components. So if you get a chance, use component, right? That'll save you some complexity and all that stuff, right? All right, so there's a talk out there. It's called Angular in 60 minutes. It is excellent. If you're brand new to Angular, I recommend watching it. And 60, I think it's about 71 minutes it ended up being. I guess the talk was planned for 60 minutes. They went 71 minutes. But he does a really good job of explaining from first concepts all the main things that you need to know for Angular 1.x. That talk is a few years old, so some of it is a little outdated, but I think they put little bubbles up and say, hey, this has been changed since 1.2 or whatever the case may be. But it's still a great talk to get the core concept. This graphic here is basically a lift right from that talk, right? So,
You have a URL to that talk?
yep, it'll be in the notes.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. So logically, this is how Angular is modeled, like the way you would work with it on the top, right? So you have the module system, right? everything, all these things that are here, the directives, the filters, the routes, factories, all that hang off of a module, right? And this would make more sense once we jump into the code. Right? But this kind of, so you have the module at the top, then you have configuration that hangs off of that, and your routing hangs off configuration, right? Your filters hang directly off your module, so do your directives, right? But your factories, your services providers, all those also hang off of the model and the controller as well, right? So everything is gonna be like module dot. Like think of your module as your namespace, right? And I can't remember what it's called in like Java. I think it's namespace as well, right? Yeah. So module is basically your namespace. It's your container that holds your things, right? And you can have multiple modules as well. So another logical view of this, again, lifted directly from the top, is this one. So this is how things kind of work together, right? So you have your module at the top and your configuration and your routes, right? Your routes are going to point to views, right? So basically, let's say you have a myapp/view1, right? The myapp/view1 in your address bar is a route, right? That route points to a view that's going to display on the page, right? Inside of that view, you can have directives, right? Again, remember that's the new HTML that we've taught the browser to recognize, right? That view is tied to a controller via a scope, right? The scope is like your view model, is it? Ask a question. Maybe I don't need to ask a question. So a view model basically is a connection with, it's like an object that connects your view and your controller, right? It represents your data for that particular page. And again, this is more understandable. We're going to look into code in a few minutes. Okay? And your controller also sometimes can have factory services, values, all those things injected into it. I put factory here because that's the default that I go with and the projects that we use. Okay? So stop me if you have any questions, because I think one of the big gripes that Angular gets is that it's complex, right? But it is, but it's not when you start off. It doesn't start off that way. I just want to give you guys some high-level concepts, and then when we look at the code, you'll put those together. Okay?
Andre, does it have any browser minimum requirements?
Yes, it does, and I can't remember what they are. I think it's like IE 8 or IE 9. But it's pretty far back.
Yeah, those are older.
Yeah. So all your evergreen browsers are going to be good, right? Your IE and your old Safari, I think we're mostly IE 8 and 9, which I don't think anyone here should be on any longer. All right. This is out of order, but some good resources. John Papa's Style Guide. He does an excellent job, and it's not just him, but it started with him, but it's community driven, and now it's been adopted by the Angular team as well. He does a really good job of breaking down, like as you're writing your code, how you should write your code. And not just like actually let me show you real quick. No, not code break yet. Let me show this for a second. All right, so it's on GitHub. You can contribute to it if you like. So he does a really good job. And one of the reasons I really like his this one is because it tells you the what, but it also tells you the why, right? So let's say ifs, right? Remember I mentioned about scoping in JavaScript, right? So usually in JavaScript, you don't want to do this. Like he'll say, here's what you want to avoid, right? Can everyone see that? Yeah. Make it a little bigger, sorry. All right, so you want to avoid this, right? Right, and it's hard to see what you're really avoiding, so you see what is recommended. You want to wrap your code in an IFI, right? And an IFI just is an immediately invoked function, because the only scope that you have is a function scope. So you just wrap all your code in a function, and that makes all your variables that would have been global scope to that area. So you don't run into collisions where someone else says, I want to use the variable X because X is cool. you're already using X, right? And so who wins? It's a toss-up, right? Whoever gets loaded last, they win. Right? So you don't want those collisions to happen. So you wrap all your things in an immediately evoked function, and that moves that problem, right? Yeah.
It's does Angular make it easier to avoid globals altogether?
In a way, yes, because you end up putting stuff into your module, and that becomes a scoping for you as well. So, good question.
I have another question. Have you run into performance issues
Yes,
with one?
yes. But we run into performance issues when we're looking at thousands and thousands of things all at the same time. So you will run into these things, but only at scale, right? I can't remember if it's 4,000 or 10,000 watchers, you start to see a noticeable difference. Not a performance problem, but a noticeable, human noticeable difference in performance. That's a lot of items, right? Sometimes you just have to rethink your UI. Say, okay, wait a minute, should we really be displaying 10,000 things?
And there's that you had, when I had that, I don't know how many watchers, and you found some.
Yeah, I didn't put that. I'll put that in the notes as well. There's a little function that we found that tells you can put in your snippets. And I don't have the same computer as I did last time, so I might not have it on this one. But you can put in your Chrome debugger and basically just run that, and it'll tell you how many watchers you have. Right. The other one that we talked about is this is a while ago, but your Chrome DevTools has a flame graph. Understanding what that flame graph is can help a lot, especially when you're talking about the digest cycle. So we'll probably reiterate on the flame graph another time. But those are two things that you can use to analyze your performance issues if you run into performance issues, which is not likely until you reach a pretty big scale. But just to be aware of it, because a number of people have run into that performance issue. So the Angular API we've looked at already. There's a couple of podcasts I really like. There's Angular Air, which now they started to do like these online recorded tutorials where they get like, like the guy that wrote you the UI router, say, hey, let's walk through the UI router, and they like break it down for you. Right? And you can ask questions. So if you watch it live, you can ask questions of the people that are actually doing these things. Right? I never get to watch it live, but I still benefit from it a lot. Adventures in Angular, John Papa is one of the panelists on that one. That one's really, really good. So John Papa, Ward Bell, a few other people that are actually they're not on the Angular core team, but they Ward Bell is the one leading the documentation for Angular. And John Papa is the one that does the style guide for Angular. So they're pretty invested in it, and they give their understandings and stuff in there. JavaScript Jabber more general, but it's still, they touch on a number of things. Like I mentioned, the video, Angular 60th minutes, and Pluralsight has about, I can't remember how many, but there's, they have about, there's a lot of courses basically on Angular on there. Highly recommend it. All these are Angular in depth, Angular 2.0, all of these things. So definitely recommend that. You can, if you don't have a subscription, you can get a trial for like 30 days or something like that. Got a question, Marshall?
No,
Okay, scratching. All right. So code break. A lot of concepts. So let's look at code. All right. So live coding, because that never goes wrong. And in case it does, we'll have a backup. And can everyone see that? More or less. Close. All right, so we're gonna minimize the things that we don't need. So we're gonna start a brand new page. So we can start from scratch. And stop it. Stop this from running. We're going to brand new HTML page, right? We don't need tests because we're not writing any tests. All right. So everyone recognizes this, right? And so we'll start off with saying a little H1 tag here, and we'll say hello. Group. That. We'll pull it up in our browser. This will only take a little while the first time we set this up, and then all the stuff going. Part of this is because I don't know if I even got to that, but I'll show you some stuff in the back end. All right, so very basic. Hello, it's just HTML, no Angular there yet, right? So let's add some Angular to that. So in order to add Angular, first we need to add the library, right? So let's add a script tag. What's this source, right? And I've already downloaded that, and it's there. Okay. So now we have Angular, and we're going to add another tag here just to get Angular jump started. So we're going to say ng-app. And with that, we now have Angular, right? Right? Cool, right? So what does that actually do for us? Absolutely nothing at this moment. So let's make it do something cool. One of the first things you'll always see is data binding, two-way data binding, because you just have to write a lot of code just to do this little thing. So let's add a text box. Type. And we're going to say, I'm going to give this another directive, ng model name. And then we're going to output name here. All right. So let me describe what's happening here. So ng-app, remember I said there were built-in directives, right? ng-app is one of those built-in directives. It's like, hey, where do you want your Angular to start at? Where do you want Angular to start looking at, right? So I can put this at the HTML tag. I can also put it at the body tag. I can put it as a div wherever I want, right? It doesn't really matter. One of the beauties of Angular, I think it's a full framework, but you don't have to have everything in Angular. So if you have an existing app, you want to make part of it more dynamic, so the Angular tag in there, you're good to go, right? Doesn't have to take over your entire app, right? So you can, and that way you can sprinkle it in kind of like jQuery, right? This other one here, ng model, right? It's another built-in directive. It's saying, hey, the thing that you type into this inbox, I want you to put that value in a thing called name. If name doesn't exist, hey, create it for me, right? This other one here is also data binding. It's just saying, take the thing in name and display it here, right? Cool. Any questions? All right, so, and the magic starts. All right, so we have our text box, right? That's not so right. Because live coding sucks, right? All right, so my name's Andre, right? So as you see, as I'm typing, it's automatically putting it in there. So that's data binding, right? There is a delay in between when you type it and when it comes up, but no human can see it, right? So again, hopefully. And once you get, again, you have to have a bunch of them. What we've done here, though, we've added 2 watchers to this, right? The ng model adds a watcher, and this guy over here adds another watcher, right? So we're already at 2, right? So you can see as you add more and more stuff to your screen. Yeah, you got a question, Clayton?
Aren't there built-in watchers even before we start adding watchers?
Yeah, I think there's, if I found the script, I can find it, but I think there's probably like 2 or 3 that are already there. But for the most part, consider the things that you have here. Right?
What's a watcher do? Kind of
briefly. So watch your watches, right? So
watches for keyboard input.
It watches for changes, right? And so we'll touch on that one near the end. It'll watch for change and it'll kick off the digest cycle. And the digest cycle basically just goes through and says, hey, everyone, like text box, if you got a change for me, cool, I'll handle that. Image box, you have a change for me, whatever. It'll go through your entire part that's under your ng app. And so they're gonna say, hey, do you have changes? Do you have changes? Do you have changes?
Pulls all the components.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you have for them.
And so again, this is where your performance thing comes in, right? Because the more watches you have, the more places it has to go and ask that question. And the part when you run into a performance issue is that sometimes you can have one watcher or one part, say, let's say I had a first name, a last name, and I wanted the output to be first name and last name, right? When I change first name, I need to change the other one, right? Let's say that fed back into another field. It fed back into the last name field or something. So that it'll have to go through that cycle multiple times, and it'll keep going until everyone says, I'm good, and then it'll stop, right? So how you architect your system, your app, will vary on your performance. We'll jump ahead a little bit, and I'll just do this. So if I do put that syntax in there, what that's going to do is say, find the very first time you see name with the value that you have in name, and do not bind it again. Remove the watcher, right? That's good for, like, you have a report page. I think the page we were running into performance issues with Layton's app was that we had a ton of things to put out on a report page. They were never going to change once you ran the report. So we did not need watchers still being there.
Would you convert it to plain HTML maybe?
Yeah, so that's what more or less it does. So if I go back now and refresh the screen, I believe as we type, you saw the F go in, but nothing else came in after that. Right? Right. You do that as a performance hack. You notice as you took it out, it still didn't, it won't change it. Right? All right, so let's add another directive that you'll often see, ng repeat. So let's do a div, no, let's do a UL, unordered list, and we'll do, and we'll put in here, ng, we're going to change this. Eventually we'll be filtering based on that. I don't know about crap, we're running out of time. All right, so, and so we have a thing called names there. We're going to add some JavaScript down here. Thank you. Live coding. All right, so let's add some JavaScript. And we're going to skip ahead a bit, and we're going to add a controller as well. So, we're going to do, so right now I'm going to create a module. Remember the module we talked about before? So this is actually going to create a module. It's going to call it app. And this is the syntax for that. So what I'm saying here is, create a module, call it app, right? This, I'm going to actually come here and just say this is now that same app, right? And then off of that app, I want you to create a controller. We're going to call this function. And we're going to live coding. All right, so I added a lot to this. I want to take it step by step, but we're running out of time, right? So what this is saying here, let's try.
Probably don't need double quotes in that one.
No, I think it's a very, let's see. Let's test cheap for a bit.
Unless it's your objective. It might be that you don't need the quotes unless you're objecting.
Yeah. Where is my controller? Oh, you're right. No quotes. All right. So let's say that. Actually, let's do this. All right, since we don't really have time to walk through everything, we're going to just jump to the end. All right, so I did this morning. So you notice here, I'll walk through a little bit of what we have here, is that we have this app controller, right? And in there we have a scope variable. Remember I said that's like your glue between your view and your model, right? And we have a parameter called people in there, right? And so this is some data that we have inside of people. We have a URL for an image. We have an account object inside of there with a balance, right? And of course, I have like no money in my account, right? $5 because that's how it goes. Above here in the HTML, we are listing through. Actually, let's do this one first. Directive, and we'll get to that one in a minute. We're listing through we're doing an ng repeat here over people, and we're filtering that based on the name input box. Right? So let's see what that looks like here. All right. So young family bank, right? And so we have, again, the filters here. So if I type in IND, right, it filters down just to India. If I type in AN, it filters down to Andre and Anuetta, right? Cool. All right, that makes sense to everyone? All right. So we also have a couple other things that are in here too. So you see a debit account and a credit account, right? Because this is a contrived example, you can only debit and credit based on a already specified amount. So in here we have a credit function and we have a debit function, and we notice that we put those on our scope, right? Because now our view can actually use them. If they weren't on our scope, then our view couldn't use them, right? So because they're on our scope, then the view can get to it. And the credit account just basically calls the adjust account and it adjusts it by that amount, right? And so this goes up 20 and it goes down 30 for debits, right? So if I click on credit, you notice the value here. Actually, oh, wow, definitely not what I wanted to do. Let's just do that. All right, so if I hit credit, you notice the value went up here, all right? See it go up. One of the other things is I outputted it here as well. So you see the value 85 here and the value 85 there, right? And this is really cool once you start realizing what's happening, right? That means that you have one source of the truth, right, somewhere, and everything points to that source of truth.
Single.
Huh?
A single thing.
Almost, right? So that source of truth now, if let's say you have a name field in your application and it's here, right? And it's also over here and it's also over there, right? Before you have to write code that says, when this one changed, remember to go change that one and that one, right? And then when this one changed, remember to go change that one and that one, right? And then when the other one changed, remember to go change the other two, right? Data binding makes that go away, right? It says, when you change, tell the source of truth to change, and everyone else will look at that and say, hey, we need to update ourselves with that, right? That's the cool part, right? So let's see what happens as I debit money, not from my account, but we'll debit from my wife. Right? She's overdrawn, right? All right, so a couple things happen here just to show you guys what's happening in the HTML, to show a couple of things, right? So actually, this is her thing on her website too for her job. I was looking for a picture for her, and it's like last minute. And it's a different, my work computer didn't have any on here. So I Googled her name and found that picture. I'm like, oh, that's funny. All right, so let's see. All right, so you notice that these are the buttons here. So this is the button for the one that's in red. So that's the debit, right? And then this credit is the one in green, right? And we have inside the one in red an ng if, right? And we say basically, if your account balance is greater than 0, show this button. The moment that's no longer true, no matter how it's not true, this no longer applies, right? So do not show this area. Do not show this tag, right? That's one of the built-in ones that are built in there. You can also use ng show and ng hide, right? ng show will say if the thing inside of the bracket revolves to true, then show this thing. If not, hide it, right? So like, why do I have two? Why do I have an ng if and an ng show? I don't have 3 actually. Why do I have an ng if, ng show, and ng hide? Because they work differently, right? So ng show will just mask it. It'll take CSS and say, hey, do not display this thing, but the thing is still on the page, right? If you do that, let's say you have a big block of code that says, if you're an admin, you get to see this big block of thing, right? And that has a lot of sophisticated things in there, right? And remember we talked about watchers, right? So all those sophisticated things in there, they're a performance hog on your page, but not everyone needs to see that. NG show or NG hide and hide it from the page, but then they're still getting the performance hits of that thing being, because all the watchers, all the updates are still happening, right? If you do an NG if, it removes it completely from the doc. It's not there, right? Right. So there is a penalty. If you're going to have something that's going to switch back and forth between that, now you have to rehydrate all that stuff into the doc. So just be aware of how your app is going to work, and then you make a determination whether you want to do an NG if or NG show, right? All right. So the other parts of this too is I think that one, the NG show is the account overdrawn thing. This comes up by NG show if you credit a little bit, and then it goes away, and she's back at 45%, which usually is more like that. Yeah, and that. So, all right. Let's see what else we had in here. So we had the image. The image is also being data bound in, right? You notice that we're not using source here. We're using ng-source, right? A lot of the reasons why you end up having these built-in directives is because if you do something outside of the scope of Angular, it does not know it happened, right? So you have to do certain things like either using an Angular directive where it says it'll watch that thing and it says when it happens, start the digest cycle off, right? But sometimes you'll do things that are not inside that scope. I wish I'd have had this already queued up for you guys, but I'll try to bring it up really quickly in the background. So I'll show you guys an app that we built on Angular really quick, and it's a little bit more complex. Some of you might have seen it already. So you notice up here this address bar, and that's going to be run by this here. So when I click on that guy, you notice it changed, right? And I can change this around, and the views will change, right? So each one of these things in here is a different directive. So the part with the tree view over here, that's a directive, right? So I can reuse that in multiple places. Each one of these tabs in here, scroll down, are a directive. So the security, all the stuff for security, we just read anytime we need the security stuff, we just take the tag and drop it in the other part, right? And it's there, right? And same thing for roles and followers. Actually, let's see if we do this one. All these are directives. So each one of these little guys in here, the user plus his name and his image, that's a directive. Let's see. There I am there. So you see the data binding happening when I search. It's searching real time. Gives me my stuff right away, right? Let's see, I click on that guy. Close. See it there. Save the changes. All updates, right? So all these are most of them are directives because I can then reuse that in multiple parts of my app. So I want to build a new page, and I need the follower part to say who follows what, right? I need to see who comments on things. I just take that directive that I've already built, drop it on the page, I'm done. Right? And that's one of the beauties of Angular. If you design your app properly, you have a bunch of reusable components that you can use all over the place. One of the things that's interesting though is that the actual part of the tree that does the dynamic loading and unloading is jQuery. It's not Angular, right? But you can have jQuery and Angular talk to each other. If you say, hey, whenever jQuery you do something interesting, you need to let Angular know about it. I just take this function called scope.apply and says, hey, Angular, something changed. Take a look at it, right? And that's how you can connect those two worlds together. In Angular 2.0, you don't have as much of that problem because they use a thing called zones where it's like this watches part of the page. It's a lot cleaner, a lot easier. With that said, I'm going to run through some of these slides at the end. Like I said, there's a lot of material, and we're nearly going to be able to cover it. So we just looked at NG app, NG model, NG controllers. We saw some of the filters. I didn't tell you about this one, but the money values that were showing up on the page, you saw how they had $, and that's another filter. I just give you a number and you format it for me as a currency, right? Don't care how you do it, just do it, right? The filter is the one that we saw when you actually put the value in there and you call filter, and well, you didn't call it, you called itself, right? So we talked about modules as containers. This is the syntax. This will bite you at first. The first one at the top is the syntax for creating a module. The one at the bottom is the syntax for getting that module, right? The only difference is this part here. Crap. The list of dependencies, right? And that's where your dependency injection comes in, right? Controllers, all those things are based on dependency injection as well. A lot of times you may have a module with no dependencies, and these two syntaxes look very similar. So like, why is this not working? That may be the case, maybe the reason, right? We talked about this, we talked about data binding, maybe show like you have controller, directives. So we didn't really get into the directives, so let me show that really quickly. Let's see. All right, so you notice I commented out that thing down there, right? So all these are account. All this code in here represents our account. I can comment that out. Actually, let me not even comment it out, so I don't need it anymore. I'm just going to delete it and do that. So now we have an account holder directive, right? It just says account holder, right? And then I'm passing in the person from my ng repeat. I don't think we even really specify that, so let me pull this up on this side. This one, fresh. All right, so you notice the same thing show up, even though I deleted a bunch of code. That's because that code is duplicated in my directive, right? So now my HTML, if you're reading the HTML, looks a lot cleaner. It looks like exactly what I'm trying to do, right? So if there's a bunch of hidden logic in there that is not relative to the information you're trying to convey, that's why it makes your markup a lot more semantic, I think is what they use, right? It's literally saying what you're trying to do, right? So I think the only difference here should be, actually I didn't save it, that's why. It should look a little different. You see, okay, so it looks a little different because I want to make sure you know that it was a different part that was bringing it in. So the names before were all uppercase, and that was because we use a filter called uppercase. Right now we're using another filter inside a directive called lowercase, and added the word directive in front of it, just so you know, like, no, there's no matching here. It really is not from a different area, right? But the functionality is still the same, right? And what's cool about it is that I don't have to write that functionality inside of my directive. What I'm doing here is saying, hey, directive, here's the person, right? You have a thing called credit, right? And here's a function that you should execute when credit gets called, right? So I can pass in functions and I can pass in data, and I can bind both ways, up and down, right? So the value gets changed there, but also, let's say, down here. So you, come on, you can't see it. Lissy's value is moving up, right? And then when I debit her account, her balance is going down, right? And that's on a different part of the page, right? So just to see how that actually looks in code. So yeah, that's right. I had the directive on the page. So, okay. So here's our directive right here, right? So app, remember app is the same as saying module, angular.module.app.controller. They just gotta put a variable in there. They tell you not to do that. There's a bunch of stuff in here that I do. Don't do it, it's for demo purposes only. But in the style guide, you'll see really good how you should actually structure your code. And the virtual folders one that I showed before, we're gonna open source that. So you'll see another real life example of what it looks like when you
take that style checker and go against your code.
Yes, they have linters. They'll have linters, I think, specifically for Angular 2.0. I don't run any of the Angular linters on my code, but the built-in Visual Studio does some of those linting for you. Good question. All right, so directives are cool, but they're also very, very confusing, and the API surface is ridiculously large, right? So in general, all you really need to do a directive is that one, restrict, And you can take all that out, and that's still a valid directive. Right? That's just saying, hey, I want this directive to be either an attribute, or I can say div and then say ng dash, not ng, or I can say div dash account holder, right? And it'll work. And I can also say account holder as a tag itself, and it'll also work because I have the A and the E in there. There's also a C, which no one actually uses, like make my comment a directive. It's a horrible idea. So don't do that one. Other parts of this are saying I have a controller, right? And that controller is there, but I can also have it be a name function somewhere else. I want that controller to be visible as VM. This is one of the better practices that you want to do. So everywhere you saw me put in $scope, you don't really want to do that because it doesn't translate well over into Angular 2. And when you have multiple of these things on one page, it can get confusing. Like which $scope, what controller does that apply to? I don't know, right? So it's better to do it this way. And I'll show you what that looks like. And so here I'm saying that there are 3 variables that are going to be passed in, 3 attributes for this account holder. One is called person. This just means do a 2-way data binding on person. So if I change it inside of the directive, let the guy outside know, right? And then this one is saying bind this function, debit and credit to whatever you pass in, right? Another key one. So you notice here it says account holder, account capital H holder, right? But in our HTML, it shows as account dash holder. Right? Don't know why that happens or why they decided to do that. I think it was something with the
So camel case resolves as a hyphen, I think.
Yeah, I think it was because in the HTML there's no distinction between upper and lower case, right? So there was a reason for it. I don't know what the reason is. In the component world, I think it does a little bit differently in Angular 2. It's a little bit different too as well. But this can fight, it's bit me before. It's like the directive's there, it works, but it's not showing up because everything that you put in that the browser doesn't understand is you just want me to ignore that, so I'll ignore it for you. Right? So just be aware of that, right? A few gotchas. One of the other gotchas I'll mention really quickly is that the error messaging. So remember in our slides, we talked about, let's see, code break, another code break. We're not going to have time for that. So back. Oh, this one. All right. So remember I mentioned that there were factory services, providers, and values? I lied. There's really only a provider. Right? Provider is the underlying mechanism for all of those other things. Right? You don't really want to use a provider, but just know that it's using a provider under the scenes. So why is this important? So if I have a factory called Andre Factory, right? If I do something screwy and it's not working, the error message is going to say the provider for Andre, right? And you're like, what provider? I have no stinking provider called Andre, right? It's saying that something screwed up here, but the stack trace is giving you the underlying thing down there, right? So if you see something like missing, can't find Andre, you probably want to name an Andre factory provider. You say like Andre, right? That's the name of the provider of the factory. It'll say can't find Andre provider, right? And it's probably because I misnamed where I injected it in, like somewhere I say A-D-R-E, which I've been known to do, and it should be A-N-D-R-E. It says I can't find A-D-R-E provider. And like I have nothing called that anywhere, right? Just know that, right? There's a few other little gotchas with the error messaging that don't think we'll have time to jump into.
Thanks, Andre.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for getting the pizza. Appreciate that. So what we'll do then, it seems like we're still hanging around, so we'll talk about a little bit about these.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How does Angular compare to other Java frameworks?
So JavaScript frameworks are like tribes, right? So you pick one and you kind of stick with it most times.
Other ones?
Huh?
You fight people who use other ones?
Yes, everyone that does the other one is wrong. They're all wrong. They're all evil, they're stupid, but mostly they're wrong. So that being said, Angular is the more popular in industry, right? Because of the ease of getting started with it, because it appeared to be backed by Google. A lot of businesses and industries picked it up. So the community of Angular is at least 4 or 5 times bigger than most of the other communities, right? Now, all the new, say, a lot of the people at the high end of development, not high end of development, most vocal out there people, a lot of them have switched to React. And they'll tell you how much better React is than Angular. And in some ways, it's true. But React, remember I said, is a library, it's not a framework. So if I pick up React, it's going to help my view part, all those parts of like data binding, right? But then I got to pick up Redux, right, to do my data management. I got to pick up something else to do my view. I got to pick up something else to do my AJAX calls, which we didn't get to in this one, right? And every other little thing that you would have to do within a framework provides for you, you would have to do your own self. And that works for some people that are really well versed in the JavaScript landscape. And they say, I want best of breed every little thing, right? But for most industry people, I don't have time for that. It needs to have to work until they pick Angular. Now, how Angular is like so you have, on one side, you have the libraries, like React, right? So that's the whole do it yourself, build it your own way. We have no opinion, you do your thing, right? Angular sits in the middle, and then on the other side of that, very opinionated, is Ember, right? So Ember does way more for you, right? But it tells you how you should structure your file system, how you should, there's the Ember way, like do it this way. If you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, it's the same sort of concept, like do it this way. If you step out of that, you know what you're doing because we will fight you, all right? We will fight you and fight you, and you can do it, but it's going to be hard if you're not doing it the Ember way. So that's kind of where it fits in. So Angular 2.0 is a slightly different animal. Angular 2.0 is in some ways less opinionated. All the benefits that you get from React, you get in Angular 2, plus a lot more. Conceptual wise, there's some things that are similar, but it's a different framework. Like it uses TypeScript and ES6 and classes and observables, a lot of other things that Angular 1 doesn't use out of the box.
So would it be preferable to start with 2.0?
Depends on what you're doing and when you're releasing it. All right. So again, it's in RC2 now, but there's like from RC1, like all the betas, APIs changed drastically. RC1 to RC2, the API changed again, right? So if you want to be on the bleeding edge, you'll get a better framework, but you have to realize that you're not guaranteed that your APIs won't shift out from underneath. Angular 1.5 is pretty good for the most part. The thing going to Angular 1.5 is that you kind of know you're going to a legacy framework already, right? Because the other one's right around the corner, right? We personally are using all Angular 1.5 just because it's more stable. And we try to write in the style guide, it kind of points you how you can write your Angular 1.x code that would be easier to transfer to 2.0. Actually, when we do the 2.0 talk, I'll probably get into the component and a couple other techniques you can use to do your Angular 1.x code in a 2.0 compatible way. And there's a couple other things in there that help you transition from one to the other. You can actually run both at the same time. You can have parts of your view being 2.0 and parts of it be 1.x. There's some performance things with that because now you're loading 2 frameworks, right? But for most of the apps here, that really matters. Like it's more like when you're building a mobile app or something like that, where you have to worry about the bandwidth and download times, that sort of thing.
How does this handle when you have a lot of hash or a lot of data?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you basically did username or first name, last name, and account But now you've got like an HDF file,
Yeah. So
metadata.
I don't think I have the other app. So Layton's app is financial data where we have millions of transactions that are there. Obviously, we don't try to display millions of transactions that would want, but you have on some of them. I think there were how many, like 50,000 watchers that we had on one particular page, and it handled it relatively well, but it was noticeably slower than the other pages that we had. And again, that's where that find once syntax came in. For like, we have that many things, how likely they all to be changed. Right. So some of it's just static data. You can just say, hey, put this on the screen and forget that it's there. Right. And so there's a bunch of techniques for how you do it that can help with that. I would say don't do those until you run into the problem, because they make your app a little bit more complex. So you're solving a problem that you don't have yet. You may never have. Don't worry about it until it happens. Good question, though.
Question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by it appeared to be supported by Google?
So people in Google started it. So Misco and I can't remember the name. They started, but it's an open source project. It's always been an open source project. But there are people at Google that were working on it. Now it's more supported by Google because they use it a lot in their internal apps.
That one page where it said Angular by Google.
Yeah. So it is now like endorsed by it, but when it first started off, people were like, oh, this is backed by Google. It must be good. Just used it, right?
Google has a policy of what, 10 or 20 or 30%. You're allowed to do side projects a week.
That's how this started.
A lot of things.
And so it was they had an app that was really big and complex, and I can't remember. I don't want to butcher the story completely, but Misco was like, "Hey, I've been doing this thing on the side. I think I can rewrite this whole app that we've been working on for, I think it was like 8 or 9 months in 12 days." And he didn't. It was like 14 days. But they rewrote the entire app based on this framework that he was working on. Because again, it does so many of the little plumbing things that you don't care about, you just need done. And you're repeating that same logic slightly differently in a bunch of different places. Okay. So this consolidates that and does it for you, and then you're good. So, but it's not all roses, right? One of the reasons why the React people is like, oh, Angular sucks, is because once you get to a certain scope, that data binding, you change it here and it automatically change it in some other place, can cause weird bugs, right? Where it's like, how did this thing change? I don't really know how it changed, right? Because there's a bunch of stuff going on, or this bug only happens in certain instances. Yeah, because this one thing changed, it also changed the other thing that causes this bug over here, right? If you follow the style guide, that you won't have that problem as much. But this is a lot of this stuff happened before the style guide was kind of like adopted, and using data binding for the wrong purpose, right? So there's data binding like I want these two things to be in sync, and there's data binding where people use it like I want this component to talk to that component. That's the wrong mechanism to use, right? I want a messaging sort of thing to pass messages from one thing to another, not data binding. You can use data binding for it, and that's when you get into weird edge cases. I started off that way.
I know we've done a bunch of the performance tests to compare all the different libraries, and between Angular 1 and React is way faster, but Angular 2 is now like on par or faster, slightly faster than React. So they're getting down to like these really small performance.
The performance is negligible. Like Aurelia's in there too, it's pretty fast. But some of the performance things, you have to look at your particular case, right? Like what you're actually doing on your particular screen. So in one case, Angular may be slower. In another case, React may be slower based on what you're actually doing on the page with your individual data. So it's more or less, I think, understanding how each one does its thing, right? So React's really cool because it has that virtual DOM. So it's like, hey, I'm changing something, but it's not actually touching the DOM, because the DOM is the slow part. That's the part that the JavaScript part is blazingly fast. It's the interactions with the DOM that are really, really slow. So they say, hey, we'll fix that. You're telling us to do changes, but we won't quite do them just yet. We'll wait until we think you're done, and then we'll combine all those things up, and we'll change that in a virtual DOM, and then we'll take that virtual DOM and dip it with the regular DOM, and only make the least amount of changes possible to give you your new view, and remail that's like they repaint their entire view every time. That'll work when you're changing a lot of things, right? And that'll be faster, but it won't necessarily be faster if you're just changing one thing, right? So just knowing the difference between what they're doing under the covers can kind of help to figure out, you know, which one will be faster for your case. For the most part, neither, and it's negligible, right? Because they're all really fast now. Right? Yeah. Any other questions? All right. So the notes will be out in the